The cold winter wind whipped through the police parking lot as Officer Tom Chen sat in his patrol car, staring at his phone. The screen's blue light illuminated his tired face, showing the deep worry lines that had formed over the past few weeks. His hands were shaking so badly he had to type the number 3 times before getting it right. His daughter lay in the children's hospital across town, her small body fighting a battle that no child should have to face. The doctors had called that morning with news that made his heart sink. The standard treatments weren't working. They needed to try something experimental, something that insurance companies considered too new to cover. Tom had always been proud of being able to take care of his family on a police officer's salary. Sure, they weren't rich, but they had enough for a modest home, good food on the table, and even a small savings account. But now, that savings account was empty, and the medical bills kept piling up like autumn leaves in his front yard. He looked at the piece of paper on his dashboard where he'd scribbled the number. His partner had given it to him, saying his cousin knew someone who worked at Trump Tower. It's a long shot, his partner had said, but what do you have to lose? Tom had spent the last 3 days gathering his courage to make this call. He'd never begged for anything in his life. 15 years on the force had taught him to be self-reliant, to be the one others came to for help. But now, sitting in his patrol car during his lunch break, he felt something he hadn't felt since he was a rookie, complete and utter helplessness. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring felt like an eternity. Tom's free hand gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. He was about to hang up when a warm, professional voice answered, "Trump Tower, Executive Office." His throat went dry. The speech he practiced 100 times in front of his bathroom mirror suddenly vanished from his mind. My name is Officer Tom Chen from the 47th Precinct," he managed to say, his voice cracking slightly. "I know this is unusual, but I'm calling about my daughter. She's very sick." The secretary's voice softened immediately. Tom could hear papers shuffling in the background as he began sharing his story. He told her about his daughter's diagnosis 4 months ago, about the rounds of treatment that didn't work, about the mounting bills that threatened to drown his family. His voice grew stronger as he spoke about his little girl's courage, how she still managed to smile even on her worst days. "She wants to be a police officer like her dad," Tom said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "She says she's practicing being brave through all of this." The secretary didn't interrupt, didn't rush him. When he finished, there was a moment of silence on the line. "Officer Chen," she said finally, "I can't make any promises, but I will personally make sure Mr. Trump gets this message. Can you leave me your contact information?" Tom recited his number and email, not daring to hope, but feeling somehow lighter for having tried. He thanked the secretary and ended the call, then sat in his car for a few more minutes, collecting himself before heading back to his shift. As he pulled out of the parking lot to resume his patrol, Tom didn't know that his message would spark a chain of events that would change his family's life forever. He just knew that for the first time in months, he felt something different than despair. He felt a tiny flicker of hope. 3 days passed without a word. Tom tried to keep his mind focused on his work, patrolling the streets and helping the community as he always done. But every time his phone rang, his heart jumped a little, hoping it might be news from Trump Tower. On Wednesday afternoon, he was sitting in his usual spot at Joe's Diner, halfway through his turkey sandwich, when his phone lit up with an unknown New York number. His coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth as he answered the call. "Officer Chen," a professional voice asked. "This is Catherine from Mr. Trump's office. Mr. Trump would like to meet with you personally tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Would that be possible?" Tom nearly knocked over his coffee cup. Yes, of course," he stammered, already mentally calculating how he could rearrange his shift. His surgeon had been understanding about the situation with his daughter, always trying to help with schedule changes when needed. "Wonderful," Catherine replied. "Please bring any relevant medical documentation you have. Mr. Trump likes to be thorough in these matters. She gave him instructions about where to park and which entrance to use at Trump Tower. That evening was a blur of activity. Tom's wife, Lynn, helped him gather all their daughter's medical papers, organizing them neatly in a folder. They stayed up late into the night, discussing what to say, what to ask for, how to explain their situation. Lynn ironed his dress uniform twice, making sure every crease was perfect. "Just be honest," she said, straightening his collar. "That's all we can do." Their daughter was having a good day, actually managing to eat some soup and watch her favorite cartoons. They didn't tell her about the meeting. They couldn't bear to raise her hopes. The next morning, Tom made the long drive to New York City. The 6-hour journey gave him plenty of time to think, maybe too much time. His mind kept racing through all the possibilities. What if Mr. Trump said no? What if this was all a waste of time? What if their last chance at helping their daughter slipped away? He tried to focus on the good things instead. He thought about his daughter's smile when she was feeling better, about how she still insisted on wearing her toy police badge even in the hospital. He thought about all the people who had helped them so far. Nurses working extra hours, neighbors bringing meals, fellow officers covering his shifts when needed. The city skyline appeared on the horizon, golden in the morning sun. Tom had been to New York many times before, but never like this. He followed the GPS directions carefully, finding the private parking entrance Catherine had told him about. The security guard checked his ID, then directed him to a special elevator. "Mr. Chen, they're expecting you," he said with a friendly nod. Tom's polished shoes clicked against the marble floor as he walked through the lobby. Everything gleamed: the walls, the floors, the golden fixtures. It was a world away from his small-town police station. In the elevator, Tom straightened his uniform one last time. His reflection in the mirrored walls showed a man who looked both determined and nervous. The folder of medical documents felt heavy in his hands. Inside were papers that told the story of his daughter's fight, of treatments tried and failed, of costs that kept mounting higher and higher. The elevator climbed smoothly upward, floor numbers ticking by one after another. Tom took deep breaths, trying to calm his racing heart. He wasn't just a police officer anymore, or even a proud man who had never asked for help before. He was simply a father, willing to do anything to save his child. As the elevator neared the top floor, Tom touched the small photo in his pocket. A picture of his daughter from before she got sick, grinning widely in her Halloween police costume. That's why he was here. That's why he'd swallow his pride and ask for help. Because sometimes being strong means admitting you can't do everything alone. The elevator chimed, and the doors opened silently. This was it. The moment that could change everything. The executive floor of Trump Tower felt like another world. Soft carpet muffled Tom's footsteps as Catherine, the secretary he'd spoken to on the phone, led him down a hallway lined with framed photographs. She had a kind smile that helped calm his nerves a little. "Can I get you some water or coffee?" she asked, gesturing to a plush waiting area. Tom politely declined, though his throat felt dry as sandpaper. He sat perched on the edge of a leather chair, still clutching the folder of medical documents. The wall clock ticked loudly in the quiet room. A few minutes later, the large wooden doors opened, and a man in a crisp suit appeared. "Officer Chen, Mr. Trump will see you now." Tom stood up so quickly he almost dropped his folder. He took one final deep breath and walked into the office. The room was impressive, but not as flashy as he'd expected. Large windows offered a stunning view of the city skyline, and a desk that looked bigger than Tom's first car dominated the space. Donald Trump stood up from behind it, walking around to shake Tom's hand. "Officer Chen, thank you for coming all this way," Trump said, his handshake firm. "I understand you've got quite a situation on your hands." He gestured for Tom to take a seat in front of the desk, then sat down himself. "Tell me about your daughter." The simple question broke through Tom's nervousness. Talking about his little girl was easy. It was what he'd been doing with doctors and specialists for months now. He explained how she'd first started feeling tired all the time, how they thought it was just a flu until the tests came back. He described the rounds of treatment, the hopeful moments when they thought things were getting better, and the crushing disappointment when they learned the standard treatments weren't working. Trump listened intently, occasionally asking questions about specific details. He seemed particularly interested in the hospital's treatment plan and why insurance wouldn't cover the experimental procedure. Tom handed over the medical documents, which Trump studied carefully. "Your daughter sounds like a fighter," Trump said, looking up from the papers. "Just like her dad." He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Catherine, get Dr. Wilson at Memorial Hospital on the line, please." While they waited for the call, Trump explained that he'd had some dealings with the hospital before. "They do good work there," he said. "Sometimes these insurance companies just need a little push in the right direction." The next hour passed in a blur of phone calls. Trump spoke with hospital administrators, insurance representatives, and someone from his foundation. Tom sat quietly, watching in amazement as the man worked his connections. He used a mix of charm and firmness, knowing exactly when to push and when to back off. Between calls, Trump asked Tom more questions about his police work, about his family, about his daughter's dreams of becoming an officer herself. The conversation felt surprisingly normal, like talking to any other concerned parent who wanted to help. Finally, Trump put down the phone and turned to Tom with a slight smile. "Well, I think we've got something worked out here." He explained how the hospital's charitable foundation could cover a significant portion of the treatment costs, and how his own foundation would handle the rest. Tom felt the room spin slightly. Was this really happening? "Mr. Trump, I don't know how to thank you," he began, his voice thick with emotion. Trump held up his hand. "Just one condition," he said. "Let's keep this between us until your daughter's treatment is complete. No press, no social media, nothing that might complicate her care." Tom nodded quickly, relief washing over him in waves. As Catherine showed him back to the elevator, Tom felt like he was walking on air. The weight that had been crushing him for months had lifted. He had what every parent of a sick child desperately needs: hope. The city looked different as he walked back to his car. The same buildings were there, the same busy streets, but everything seemed brighter somehow. He couldn't wait to get home and tell Lynn the news. Their daughter would get her chance to fight. The drive home seemed shorter than the journey to New York. Tom called Lynn from a rest stop halfway back, his voice shaking with excitement as he shared the news. He could hear her crying happy tears on the other end of the line, trying to speak, but barely able to get the words out. When he finally walked through his front door that evening, Lynn ran into his arms. They stood there holding each other in their small living room, both overwhelmed by the day's events. The folder of medical documents was now filled with new papers: forms from Trump's office, contact information for the hospital's charitable foundation, and a preliminary treatment schedule. "Should we tell her tonight?" Lynn asked, wiping her eyes. Their daughter was already asleep, worn out from another day of fighting her illness. They peeked into her room, where she lay surrounded by her stuffed animals and her beloved toy police badge on the bedside table. "Let's wait until morning," Tom said softly. "Let her have one more normal night's sleep." They both knew that once the new treatment started, normal would be a distant memory for a while. The next morning, they sat on their daughter's bed and carefully explained that she would be going to a special hospital for new medicine. Her eyes lit up when they mentioned it was in New York City. She'd always wanted to see the tall buildings. "Will I get better faster?" she asked, clutching her favorite teddy bear. The hope in her voice made Tom's heart squeeze in his chest. Lynn squeezed his hand tightly as he answered. "The doctors think this medicine will help a lot," he said. "But you'll need to be extra brave. Think you can handle that, officer?" He tapped her toy badge, making her smile. "I'm already brave, Daddy," she said with all the confidence a sick child could muster. just like you. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Tom's police chief gave him extended leave, and his fellow officers organized a meal train for the family. Their neighbors promised to keep an eye on the house and water Lynn's garden while they were away. The hospital arranged temporary housing for them near the treatment center, a small apartment that would become their home away from home. Lynn packed their daughter's favorite blanket, some family photos, and enough stuffed animals to fill a toy store. The night before they left, Tom sat alone in their backyard, looking up at the stars. He thought about how close they'd come to losing all hope. Just a week ago, he'd sat in his patrol car, desperately dialing a number he wasn't even sure would work. Now, they had a real chance. He remembered something Trump had said during their meeting. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is ask for help. Those words hit home now more than ever. As a police officer, he was used to being the helper, not the one asking for help. But this experience had taught him that true strength sometimes means swallowing your pride when your child's life is on the line. Inside, he could hear Lynn singing their daughter's favorite bedtime song. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, and new hopes. The treatment wouldn't be easy. They all knew that. But at least now they had a fighting chance. Tom pulled out his wallet and looked at the business card Trump's secretary had given him. On the back, she'd written her direct number, just in case you need anything. He carefully put it back, still amazed by how one phone call, one meeting, one person's decision to help could change everything. As he walked back inside to join his family, Tom felt ready for whatever came next. They had each other, they had hope, and they had help. Sometimes, he realized, that's all you really need to face the impossible. The Memorial Hospital in New York was nothing like their small local medical center back home. Everything seemed bigger, busier, and more advanced. Tom and Lynn held their daughter's hands as they walked through the sliding glass doors for their first appointment. The nurse who greeted them wore bright purple scrubs with cartoon characters on them. "You must be our special patient," she said cheerfully, kneeling down to their daughter's level. "I heard you want to be a police officer like your dad." Their little girl nodded shyly, touching the toy badge she insisted on wearing over her shirt. Dr. Roberts, the specialist Trump had arranged for them to see, turned out to be a kind woman with gentle eyes and graying hair. She took time to explain everything in simple terms, using drawings to show how the new treatment would work. Instead of talking just to Tom and Lynn, she made sure to include their daughter in the conversation. "Think of your body like a police department," she said, making their daughter smile. "Right now, some bad guys, we call them cancer cells, are causing trouble. This new medicine is like calling in a special team of super police officers to catch them. But just like real police work, it takes time and teamwork." While they talked, Trump's office had been busy behind the scenes. The hospital administrator came in personally to tell them everything had been arranged with both the charitable foundation and Trump's organization. Tom noticed how the staff seemed extra attentive, though no one mentioned Trump's involvement directly. Their daughter's first treatment was scheduled for the next morning. That night, in their temporary apartment, they tried to keep things normal. They ordered pizza, watched cartoons, and FaceTimed with their family back home. But Tom could see the worry in Lynn's eyes, matching his own hidden fears. The treatment room was bright and colorful, with underwater scenes painted on the walls. Their daughter was nervous at first, but the nurses were amazing. They let her pick out a special blanket and gave her a stuffed penguin wearing a tiny police uniform, a gift that made her day. As the medicine started flowing through the IV, Tom's phone buzzed with a text. It was from Catherine, Trump's secretary. "Mr. Trump asked me to check how things are going." Tom sent back a quick thank you message, touched by the follow-up. Here was one of the busiest men in the country, taking time to check on a police officer's daughter. The first few hours were harder than they expected. Their little girl felt sick and scared, but she tried to be brave. "I'm tough like Daddy's police vest," she said weakly, making both her parents tear up. They took turns reading her stories and playing quiet games to pass the time. Dr. Roberts stopped by in the afternoon to check on them. She seemed pleased with how things were going, though she reminded them this was just the beginning. The first few treatments are usually the toughest, she explained. But kids are incredibly resilient. They often handle this better than us adults. Late that evening, when their daughter had finally fallen asleep in her hospital bed, Tom stepped into the hallway to catch his breath. The reality of everything hit him at once. The kindness of strangers, the hope they'd been given, the long road still ahead. A janitor mopping the floor nearby noticed his uniform and nodded respectfully. "Officer," he said quietly, "you protect us every day. Let us help protect your little girl." Those simple words from a stranger somehow meant everything in that moment. Back in the room, Lynn had dozed off in the chair next to their daughter's bed, still holding her small hand. The stuffed penguin in its tiny police uniform watched over them from the bedside table. Looking at his family, Tom felt both completely exhausted and incredibly grateful. This was just day one of many to come, but they weren't alone anymore. Sometimes help comes from unexpected places, he thought, and sometimes miracles start with a desperate phone call and a moment of kindness. As days turned into weeks at Memorial Hospital, the family settled into a new routine. Their temporary apartment became a home away from home, with drawings from their daughter taped to the refrigerator and her stuffed animals scattered across the couch. The hospital staff had become like a second family. Every morning, they'd walk hand in hand to the treatment center, counting the cars of different colors to make it feel like an adventure rather than another medical day. Their daughter insisted on wearing her toy police badge to every session, telling anyone who would listen that she was on duty fighting the bad cells. The treatments were tough. There were good days when their little girl felt strong enough to play board games and color pictures. Then there were bad days when she could barely keep her eyes open, when the medicine made her feel sick and tired. But through it all, she kept her spirit. One particularly rough morning, she looked up at Tom with tears in her eyes. "Daddy, when you catch bad guys, does it hurt like this?" The question broke his heart. He held her hand and told her about the time he'd been injured chasing a suspect, how it had hurt, but how he'd kept going because that's what brave officers do. "You're being even braver than me," he told her, and he meant it. She smiled weakly and squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. Trump's office kept their promise about staying involved. Every week, Catherine would call to check on their progress. Sometimes she had questions from the medical team Trump had consulted. Other times, she just wanted to know if they needed anything. The foundation took care of every bill without question. Lynn spent her days keeping their daughter's spirits up, turning medicine times into tea parties and decorating the hospital room with paper chains they made together. At night, when their little girl was asleep, she would sit by the window of their apartment, writing in a journal about their journey. "Someday," she told Tom, "our daughter will want to know everything about how she fought this battle." The other families in the treatment center became close friends. They shared snacks, traded stories, and helped each other through the hard days. There was a special understanding between parents in the cancer ward. No words needed, just a look or a hug was enough. One day, Dr. Roberts called them in for a meeting. Their daughter had just finished her latest round of treatment, and the early results were promising. The new medicine was doing its job. Slowly but surely, the bad guy cells were retreating. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was hope, solid and real. That evening, Tom wrote a private letter to Trump, updating him on their daughter's progress. He didn't expect a response. The man had already done more than enough. But the next day, a small package arrived at the hospital. Inside was a real police badge, child-sized, but officially made, with their daughter's name engraved on it. The note simply read, "For the bravest officer I know." When they showed it to their daughter, her eyes lit up brighter than they had in weeks. She held the badge like it was made of gold, carefully touching the engraved letters of her name. Now I'm a real police officer, she whispered, just like Daddy. That night, as Tom watched his daughter sleeping peacefully with her new badge on the bedside table, he thought about how far they'd come. From that desperate moment in his patrol car, making a call he thought would go nowhere, to here, where hope was no longer just a dream, but something they could see in the test results. The road ahead was still long, but they weren't walking it alone. Sometimes the biggest miracles, Tom realized, don't look like miracles at all. Sometimes they look like a phone call answered, a hand extended, and the simple kindness of strangers becoming friends. 3 months into the treatment, spring arrived in New York City. The trees outside the hospital started showing tiny green buds, and the air felt warmer when they walked to their morning appointments. But the biggest change wasn't in the weather. It was in their daughter's latest test results. Dr. Roberts could barely contain her smile as she showed them the scans. "The treatment is working better than we expected," she explained, pointing to areas where the cancer had retreated. "Your daughter's response to the medication has been remarkable." Their little girl, sitting on Tom's lap during the meeting, didn't fully understand the medical terms, but she knew something good was happening. "Are the bad guys running away?" she asked, touching her real police badge that she now wore proudly every day. "Yes, sweetheart," Dr. Roberts answered. "They're definitely running away. And you're doing an amazing job catching them." The doctor looked at Tom and Lynn. "We'll need to continue the treatments, but we can start spacing them out more. You might even be able to spend some time at home between sessions." The news hit them like a wave of fresh air. That evening, they celebrated with a tiny party in their apartment. The nurses had helped decorate with streamers, and the cafeteria staff surprised them with a special cake. Their daughter had more energy than they'd seen in months, dancing around the room in her hospital socks. Tom stepped out onto the small balcony to call his police chief with the update. His colleagues had been keeping his position open, handling his shifts, and sending care packages every week. The chief's voice cracked with emotion when Tom told him the good news. "The whole department's been praying for your little girl," he said. "Even got some of the local kids to make her cards. When can we expect our youngest officer back on patrol?" Later that night, while their daughter was playing with her favorite nurse, Catherine called from Trump Tower. Tom updated her on the progress, trying to find words to express his gratitude. "Mr. Trump wants you to know that the Foundation will continue covering everything for as long as needed," she assured him. "He believes in seeing things through." The other parents in the treatment center celebrated with them. Over the months, they'd formed their own little support group, sharing both the hard days and the victories. One mom brought homemade cookies, another dad played guitar, and together they turned the hospital playroom into a space of joy and hope. Lynn found their daughter sitting by the window that evening, holding her badge up to catch the setting sun. "Mommy," she said thoughtfully, "when I grow up, I want to help people like Daddy does, and like the person who helped us." Tom and Lynn shared a look, remembering Trump's request to keep his involvement private until the treatment was complete. "That's a wonderful idea, sweetie," Lynn said, stroking their daughter's hair, which was starting to grow back in soft patches. "The world needs more people who help others." That night, Tom couldn't sleep. He walked the quiet hospital corridors, nodding to the night shift nurses he'd come to know. 3 months ago, these halls had seemed frightening and strange. Now they felt familiar, almost comfortable. He stopped by the window where he often stood during difficult nights. The city lights twinkled below, and somewhere out there was Trump Tower. Tom thought about how one person's decision to help had created a ripple effect of kindness. From the hospital staff to other patients' families, from his police department to complete strangers. It reminded him of why he'd become a police officer in the first place, to be part of something bigger than himself, to help make the world a little better. As he headed back to their room, he passed the hospital chapel. Through the open door, he could see others like him, parents, family members, all fighting their own battles, all holding on to hope. In that moment, he said a quiet thank you, not just for the help they'd received, but for the reminder that even in the darkest times, good people still existed, ready to extend a helping hand. 6 months into their journey, the family finally got the news they'd been praying for. Dr. Roberts gathered them in her office, now familiar and comfortable with its walls of children's drawings and medical degrees. Their daughter sat between Tom and Lynn, swinging her legs and wearing her cherished police badge. The latest tests show no signs of active cancer cells, Dr. Roberts announced, her professional demeanor briefly cracking into a wide smile. The treatment has been successful beyond our highest expectations. The words took a moment to sink in. Lynn burst into tears, pulling their daughter into a tight hug. Tom sat perfectly still, afraid that if he moved, he might wake up and find it was all a dream. Their little girl looked up at them, confused by the grown-up's reaction. "Does this mean I won?" she asked, touching her badge. "Did we catch all the bad guys?" Dr. Roberts knelt in front of her. "Yes, sweetheart, you caught them all. You're the bravest officer I've ever met." She then explained they'd need regular checkups, but they could go home and return to their normal life. Back in their temporary apartment, Tom made the calls they'd been hoping to make for months. First to his police chief, then to their families, and finally to Catherine at Trump Tower. Each call felt like releasing a breath he'd been holding for half a year. Catherine's voice was warm with genuine joy. "Mr. Trump will be so pleased to hear this," she said. "He's been following your daughter's progress reports every week." She paused, then added, "He wanted me to remind you that the foundation will cover any follow-up care she needs. You focus on getting your little officer back home." That evening, the hospital staff threw a surprise graduation party in the children's ward. Nurses, doctors, and other families gathered to celebrate. Someone had made a small paper police car as a cake topper, and the other kids from the ward had signed a giant card. Their daughter, feeling stronger than she had in months, proudly showed off her police badge to everyone. The other parents hugged Tom and Lynn, sharing in their joy while holding onto hope for their own children still fighting their battles. The night before they left New York, Tom took a final walk through the hospital corridors. He stopped to thank each nurse, orderly, and staff member who had become part of their extended family. In the playroom, he paused to look at the wall of photos showing kids who had completed their treatments. Their daughter's picture would soon join them. Outside their apartment, the city lights sparkled as they had every night for 6 months, but tonight they seemed to shine a little brighter. Tom looked toward Trump Tower, thinking about how a single act of kindness had set off a chain of events that saved his daughter's life. Lynn was packing their belongings, carefully wrapping the stuffed animals and get-well cards that told the story of their journey. Their daughter had fallen asleep clutching both her badges, the toy one that had given her comfort through countless treatments, and the real one that had given her strength. "It feels strange to be leaving," Lynn said softly, joining Tom by the window. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm going to miss this place." Tom understood exactly what she meant. This city, this hospital, these people, they had become part of their story. In these halls, they had experienced their darkest fears and brightest hopes. They had learned that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from fighting alone, but from accepting help when it's offered. As they watched the city lights together, their daughter slept peacefully in the next room, her battle won, her future bright again. Tomorrow they would head home, carrying with them not just medical victory, but also a profound lesson of humanity's capacity for kindness. 1 year after that first desperate phone call to Trump Tower, Tom stood at a podium in his local police station's community room. It was the annual police benefit dinner, and the room was packed with officers, their families, and community members. His daughter sat in the front row, healthy and strong, wearing her real police badge on her party dress. Her hair had grown back thick and curly, and her cheeks were rosy with good health. Next to her, Lynn held her hand, both of them beaming with pride as Tom began to speak. "A year ago," he started, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I sat in my patrol car making what I thought was an impossible phone call. Our daughter was sick, our savings were gone, and we had run out of options. What happened next changed not just our lives, but how I see the world. The room fell silent as Tom shared their story for the first time publicly. He talked about the kindness they'd encountered at every turn, from Trump's unexpected help to the hospital staff's dedication, from his fellow officers covering his shifts to strangers offering support. We often think heroes wear uniforms or carry badges, Tom continued, looking at his daughter. But sometimes they wear business suits and work in towers. Sometimes they wear scrubs and work night shifts. Sometimes they're just ordinary people who choose to help when they see someone in need. As he spoke, his fellow officers nodded in understanding. They had all seen both the worst and best of humanity in their line of work. But this story reminded them that miracles don't always arrive with flashing lights and sirens. Sometimes they come in the form of an answered phone call and a helping hand. After the dinner, people came up to share their own stories of times when unexpected help had changed their lives. Tom's daughter, tired but happy, showed her badge to anyone who asked, telling them proudly how she had caught all the bad guys in her body. Later that evening, a package arrived at their home. Inside was a framed photo of Trump Tower at sunset with a simple note. A reminder that hope can be found in unexpected places. Wishing your family continued health and happiness. Tom hung the picture in their living room, next to the family photos and his daughter's graduation certificate from Memorial Hospital. It served as a daily reminder of their journey and the kindness they'd experienced. That night, as Tom tucked his daughter into bed, she asked him a question that made him pause. "Daddy, when I grow up and become a real police officer, can I help people like Mr. Trump helped us?" Tom smiled, straightening her badge on her nightstand. "You already are, sweetie. Every time you share your story, you give other people hope. And sometimes hope is the biggest help we can give." As he walked down the hallway, he could hear Lynn reading their daughter's favorite bedtime story, the one about a brave little officer who never gave up. The sound of their laughter, once almost lost to illness and despair, now filled their home again. Tom sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. He had started writing down their story, not for publicity or attention, but as a testament to the power of kindness and the strength of the human spirit. Perhaps someday, when someone else felt as hopeless as he had that day in his patrol car, their story could remind them that help can come from the most unexpected places. Outside, the stars twinkled in the night sky, just as the city lights had done during their time in New York. But now they were home, their daughter was healthy, and their story had become one of hope for others. Sometimes, Tom realized, the greatest wisdom comes not from the battles we fight, but from learning to accept help when we need it most.